Thank you, everyone. We will start the program. Thanks for all being here. Please take a seat. The word is yours first.
Thank you, Dokos. Hello, everyone. Welcome to Witte Center for Contemporary Art. And for all that are linked to this room through the online live stream that we're doing from Rotterdam, welcome all online. I am very happy to be able to introduce this program that is the Studio Witte event with Nato Thompson, as you all know, who is a longtime collaborator. The event is organized in collaboration with RASL, by Erasmus University and Willem de Kooning Academy, and Code Arts as well. And it is also one of our main partners as well, is the Piet Zwart Institute Master of Fine Art for here in Rotterdam, and Vivian Reberg, who is in the room somewhere, I don't know. Thank you very much for your collaboration as well. And I see that there's a number of Piet Zwart students, so I'm happy for that. Today, respondents are Jeanne van Heeswijk, who's here with us, and also the composer Merlijn. Thank you so much for your participation. And I will leave now to Niels and Niels van Pok from RASL to join me in welcoming our audience. Dokos will introduce our speaker. Thank you so much, Niels.
Yeah, thank you, Sophia. Good afternoon, welcome. Great to see that you are with so many of you. I see some familiar faces. I see a lot of unfamiliar faces, which is even better. My name is Niels van Poeken. I work at the Erasmus University as a double degree coordinator for RASL and also as an events coordinator. RASL is the Rotterdam Arts and Sciences Lab. It's a collaboration between Erasmus University, Willem de Kooning Academy, and Code Arts. It started in 2016, and it enables students to do a double degree. So to combine Willem de Kooning Academy or Code Arts with Arts and Culture Studies or a study at Erasmus University College. RASL is more than education. We're also setting up a transdisciplinary research agenda. And starting last year, we are organizing events under the broader umbrella of RASL events. So we're organizing talk shows, dialogues between artists and scientists, and we are organizing one major event, a keynote lecture, of which this edition, lecture by Nato Thompson, is the first one. So I'm very excited that Mr. Nato Thompson accepted our invitation. He came all the way from Philadelphia to be here among us to discuss his ideas he presents in his book, Culture as Weapon. I would like to thank Witte de Wit and Piet Zwart Institute for collaborating with RASL and for hosting this event here in the Witte de Wit auditorium. A special thanks also to Dokos. He was of great help in organizing this event, and also, of course, for willing to moderate the event. So I now like to give the floor to Dokos.
Thank you. Okay, so I am the last person up, and after that we have Nato on the program. My name is Dokos van der Made. I'm a curator of academic and public programs here at Witte de Wit. Today we are organizing from the framework of Studium Witte de Wit, which is our platform, our collaborative platform for higher education, where we shape education also beyond the institutional walls, together with partner institutions, which I run together with Juri Meese, Witte de Wit's Associate Director of Education and Public Affairs. Together with RASL, Rotterdam Arts and Sciences Lab, and the Piet Zwart MFA, we are proud to kick off this academic year, which is also one of the reasons of this event today, which we're doing with a keynote by Nato Thompson. Curator and author Nato Thompson is Artistic Director of Philadelphia Contemporary, which you joined recently. Currently, it is still a moving or pop-up institution of pop-up projects and programs, but you are working towards having a definitive building in Philadelphia, which is coming soon, I guess, next year, hopefully. Um, um, Before Philadelphia Contemporary, you were the artistic director of Creative Time. You've also been a curator at Mass Mocha. But the reason today for coming together is also for you as a writer of cultural criticism. In 2015, you already wrote a first publication in that regard called Seeing Power, Art and Activism. And recently you added a second one of cultural criticism called Culture as a Weapon, the Art of Influence in Everyday Life. The publication deals with the role that affect, as the stirring of the passions, once primarily an artistic strategy, now has in a variety of industries, from big business, marketing, to real estate development. The question rises what the implications are for us as cultural workers, artists, activists, and how to respond. Thank you for joining us today, everyone, and a warm applause for Nato.
Yeah, I'll put it in. What's up, Rotterdam? Yeah, woo. Don't you think lectures should be more like rock concerts? I'm going to do a stage dive at the end, so we're going to... Yeah, I'm good. You know, no one ever puts effects pedals on their keynote lecture microphones. It's a real missed opportunity. Okay, so I'm Nato Thompson, like you heard a lot. I am, just to clarify, currently I'm the artistic director at a place called Philadelphia Contemporary. I took the job in November, where we're building a full-scale Kunsthalle in Philadelphia. So it's going to be a big old museum where the dream is to produce some sort of synthesis between civic activation and global relevance with both international projects, but also, because I'm always suspicious of things too local, international projects as well, and vice versa. I'm so happy to be here. Thanks, Sophia. It's so great. And by the way, I'm so happy Sophia's here. I think Rotterdam's amazing, full of great artists, and I think Sophia's amazing. So it's just, it's going to work out great. I guarantee it. Everyone's lucky. Sophia's lucky. You're lucky. It's a win-win across the board. And thanks for the tripartite of collaborative initiatives to get me here. I'm glad there's that camaraderie in the great land that you're here. And also thanks for having that Santa Claus by Paul McCarthy in your public spaces. It inspires me greatly. And it's also, I put on Instagram, it's like the biggest thing I ever put on there somehow. I guess Santa Claus with a butt plug has a lot of velocity on the internet. Okay, let's talk about my book. So I had a few goals when I started this project that I want to talk about. The first is to experiment with a new kind of art writing, and that is to say, rather than using our criticism to talk about art, I wanted to use our criticism to talk about the world. So that's goal one, and you'll figure out that after goal two. Goal two, so if art and life have merged, then focus on all aspects of life as art. So in 2011, I did a show called Living as Form, and I had a lot of curatorial advisors, and it was really great. And it was looking at artists whose work blurs the boundary between art and life, okay? And you're in Holland, so you get it. Like, there's all kinds of projects out there, from permaculture projects to artists that do alternative housing as art, to artists that do community gatherings and participatory social gatherings as art, artists that do food projects as art, often many of them outside of the museum walls. And so Living as Form was an opportunity to kind of highlight these practices, right? Like the idea of art and life merging as an artistic practice. And while I was doing that show, and funny enough, I must also say that show happened exactly the same time Occupy Wall Street happened, which is, you ever have, I'm not a religious person, but sometimes the world makes you feel like there's some game in mind for you. So I was like, oh my God, Occupy is here. And all the activists were like, who cares about art meets life, man? This is life. You're boring, art. And I was like, hey, this is interesting. Anyways, I was haunted by one figure during this show, as we've all been. This is Donald Rumsfeld, whose adage resonated in my head. And he said, this is what he said actually during the Iraq War. He said, if you have a problem and you can't solve it, make it bigger. That's a tough line for someone that's your Secretary of Defense during war. But that said, as it applies to my consideration of art, I was interested in pushing this line between art and life. And so even in the exhibition, there were things that were just life in the exhibition. For example, some curators said, you should put in the celebration of Obama when he became president as a cultural phenomenon. And someone else said, you should have the protest in Tahrir Square as one of these cultural phenomena. And so I did that, and I put that in the show. But what I was haunted by, my problem, was that it was really misleading, because I kept thinking, you know what? It's not all the good team merging art and life. There's all kinds of right-wing strategies. There's all kinds of corporate strategies. There's all kinds of strategies. And I felt like it was extraordinarily misleading to just have it be about artists, and in fact, somewhat delusional. Hey, sometimes I think, you know when you finish a project and you realize it was an interesting failure? I guess that's what learning is, ultimately. But I thought, oh my God, there is this other part of this show, which is called Art Projects Not by Artists. Does this make sense? Well, I'll show you how. So, let's assume for now there is no difference between art and life, right? Let's pretend, for the sake of discussion. I'm interested in this book, and we're going to get into this. And what is it that makes artists do what they do that is relatable to other fields? And the things I kind of landed on is artists appeal at an intimate scale with emotion, intimacy, sociality, caring, love, fear, disgust, and a whole range of personal feelings, right? And artists are very good at that. And in fact, not to repeat that Hegelian sense of art, but that is how Hegel kind of broke it down, right? You got a rational and you got your emotive, and it's not how it works. But it is useful to think about the artist as someone that deals in the skill sets of affect, the affective. But I wanted to write a book, and that's what the book will discuss, is to do that, but intimacy at scale, which is those that work with big budgets and a lot of people, Facebook, news programs, humanitarian programs, IKEA, military, television programs, coffee companies, advertising firms, to affect you on a personal level. You get the idea? Yes. Because, of course, for example, and it's interesting, because I think all of you face this, right? Where you'll see a project that's like out there and it's feeding people and they're having community meetings, and the artist will say this is an artwork. And then people will say, what makes that an artwork different than like something like some NGO that goes to Africa, right? Or what makes that different than like some sort of social program? And sometimes in my head, I think the only difference really is that it's limited in scale and an artist is doing it, right? That the scale is the difference, ultimately. Or for example, like people in the United States, there's this artist, Theaster Gates, you're probably familiar with him, who does this housing redevelopment project in the south side of Chicago, where it's kind of intentional artistic housing. And he's done, people are like, it's an amazing project, it's like 9 houses, and he's doing all these incredible artistic interventions, and the community's involved, and that is true, it's really interesting. But then there's another organization called the Department of Housing and Urban Development in the United States, that does 6 million homes a year, right? So what's the difference between HUD, as it's called, and Theaster Gates? Well, one of the obvious differences is scale. But scale becomes interesting to me because, of course, then we're talking about political economy. And rather than just fetishize artists, I wanted to just turn the lens to power, turn the lens to things that operate at large scale. Let's think about that. And I hope, and we'll get to that, And I must say, because Dokus and Sophia and everyone's like, let's definitely turn it around to how we can learn from this for artists. But I must admit, in my book, it ends a little more cold, which is just like, it's very ambivalent if there's any lessons for artists. But I feel an obligation to have a light side to this and something pedagogical for you at this moment. I don't know why. I think it's good, because the times are dark. All right. Hierarchy of needs. We're all familiar with these hierarchy of needs. It's good to go through them for the sake of this conversation. So Maslow discussed this pyramid, the base being physiological, breathing, food, water, sex, sleep, homeostasis, and excretion. You know what's fun is if you could attach an artist to each one of those. The next would be safety, security of body, of employment, of resources, of morality, of the family, of health, of property. Love, friendship, family, sexual intimacy, esteem, and self-actualization. What I think is important about this is that you see a certain kind of level of needs that we have. And as people on this planet, we do have needs, and they're very emotional. And actually, you know, it's funny, because I wrote this book, and then I had a bunch, and I'll talk about a much bigger appreciation of the implications of the book. And the implication of the book, which is very simple, is that most of our knowledge comes based on this. And I would say most of our knowledge comes through the lower portion of this pyramid. And most of the ways in which knowledge is delivered to us, through your phone, through television, through the newspaper, is delivered to us at the bottom of this pyramid. Which is to say, rather than thinking that like only the uneducated masses think at the bottom of the pyramid, I'd basically say all of us think and learn at the bottom of this pyramid. While certainly it's taken academia a while to get their head around that, because it's hard to teach a class at the bottom of the pyramid, though there are those that try. Lygia Clark tried. She was kind of at the bottom of the pyramid teaching. But like, in general, I would say that this kind of Hegelian sense of rationality and the Enlightenment has made people try to teach at the top of the pyramid. But marketers, and I would say the way most of the world works, has always understood that that's how we are. And in the book, which I'm not going to get into because to give a lecture on the entire book would take an entire day, but I go into a whole history of advertising in the US context, featuring people like Edward Bernays, who was the kind of founder of public relations, who is also, poetically enough, the double nephew of Sigmund Freud, who was very aware that people are motivated by their needs and irrational desires, and was an advisor to everyone from presidents to advertising firms to the Guatemalan Food Company in Guatemala, the United Fruit Company in Guatemala. So everywhere from dictators to corporate execs to robber barons. But advertisers will basically look at this. This is so absolutely amazing. This is just something I found on the internet. It's called Content Marketing of Hierarchy of Needs. And here at the bottom, if you can see that, which I feel very deeply, is your laptop. It's right there with excretion, sex, and eating. As is coffee and internet connection. I mean, just think about how deep that is, because this is the primary mode of which we're gathering information. We'll talk about the bottom of the pyramid. Safety, love, belonging, esteem, and self-actualization. Marketers knew this all the time. And it's interesting because we have two different forces, we have many forces at work, but one of the interesting dichotomies, which people that have talked about marketing early in the 20th century realized that if this is in fact how people work, it poses a giant problem to something very fundamental called democracy. Because democracy is based on something very simple, which is people understand their needs and vote rationally based on them. But if people are extremely vulnerable and vote based on things that they can't even figure out, all of us, not just them, everyone in this room, the entire premise of democracy is problematic. And so we'll get to that, but I think it's interesting because what happens is that an entire world emerges that fundamentally is built on this knowledge of how people are. And our political systems are not built like this. And thus, we get a situation where everything that exists in power attacks us at the personal, and our democracy attacks us at the rational. So I'm going to do 3 test cases. And these 3 test cases are just 3 chapters. And these are fun, they're really fun experiments in looking at the intimate from different corporate, military, powerful, scalable vantage points. The first we will do starts with a thing called corporate sociability. And I'm going to look at some retail chains and some people. I love our protagonists in this book. We got vice presidents of marketing, we got military generals. It's like a fun cast. All right, so corporate sociability is the ways in which our desire for the social is enacted through corporate retail chains. You ready? Here we go. Here he is. The star of the show, Ingvar Kamprad. He just passed away, founder of IKEA. When he passed away, he was the 4th richest man in the world. IKEA is so absolutely chock full of interesting statistics. It's unbelievable. One of them, my favorite thing, is that their mission statement should have been the title of my book, which was Democratic Design, Low Cost with Meaning. Low cost with meaning. And to me, this whole book is about meaning. It's important low cost, but meaning production is where the book focuses. Do you know the #1 money-making business in the world? I know, you think it's like Google or Exxon. It's Walmart. Walmart. Why is that interesting? Because they're just, right here. So they're like just low cost. There's no meaning. So I don't want to overplay the hand of cultural production, right? Ultimately, the thing that's winning is just low cost. But low cost with meaning is another way to fill the marketplace. IKEA, the IKEA catalog is the most printed publication in the world. Is that amazing? More than the Bible. Also, IKEA itself consumes 7% of the world's wood. So let's just get our heads around some scale here, okay? There's also some fun art facts. So IKEA was founded in 1953. There it is. And its inspiration for its design came from a visit where Ingvar came to New York City, this is not a lie, and did a visit there. What's that? Guggenheim. So he goes around Frank Lloyd Wright's iconic building. He's walking, for those of you that have not been there, you walk in this ramp that goes like this. And he said, I'm paraphrasing, he said, this place is amazing. It feels like you're going somewhere, but you're going nowhere. Well, isn't that how everyone feels at IKEA? Here we go. So this is the design for IKEA. And as you know, you feel like some sort of Alice in Wonderland character lost in someone else's maze, but you can't help but enjoy it. I mean, if Walter Benjamin could have seen IKEA's showrooms, he would have passed out. Forget Paris arcades. Get to IKEA. So here it is. It's a hallucinatory world of intimate spaces that you, for low cost, can enjoy. You too can be a bourgeois contemporary citizen for not all that much money. And doesn't that feel good? Hey, feels good for me. And it's amazing too. Talk about intimate. Look at this. You as a viewer walk through, and not only, I mean, it's so literal, it's painful. You look at people's bedrooms and bathrooms. You can lay on their beds. You can do all this intimate stuff in this hallucinatory space of living as ambulatory experience. Can you imagine what Walter Benjamin would have, he'd just have been like, oh my God, I'm so glad I died. I had no idea. But it doesn't stop there. So, of course they've got the incredible meatballs, salmon. It's all so cheap you can't even understand what's going on. And when you walk in, you encounter this place, Småland. And this is, IKEA. Do they do this here? You have childcare there, right? So you walk in and you immediately see ebullient children jumping into piles of balls. This is what you first encounter. And it's the most important ad in the world because they're real children jumping in real balls and they're really happy. And they might even be your kids. So it's lived advertising. But it's amazing too, when this came to Brooklyn, New York, it was a total crisis because there's no child care in the United States. The state pays, as you know, we're famous for people paying for nothing. The state paying for nothing, so people pay for everything. So suddenly this giant box store shows up that says, if you shop here, we'll take care of your kids. And guess what? That was a good offer. And then there was all these articles in your Times like, Brooklyn IKEA bursting at the seams, lines out the door for people trying to drop off their children. But I laugh about it, but what's amazing about IKEA, and also ironic, and God, the ironies in this book are too painful. This is also a store whose brand is entirely social democrats, right? This is Swedish values. IKEA is the biggest tax evader of Sweden, ever. There's no money going to Sweden. But it shows all these values. We'll take care of your kids. We got low-cost food. It's about social democracy. We're the same color as our flag. This place has nothing to do with Sweden other than Ingvar Kamprad's from there. And it started there. But the money doesn't go there. One last thing. As we all know, and this I think is an accident, it's incredible. The thing that really makes you understand IKEA is you have to build it yourself, right? And many relationships have ended trying to build furniture together in IKEA. But there's a thing they call the IKEA effect. Here it goes. The IKEA theory suggests that when people use their own labor to construct a particular product, they value and love it more than if they didn't put any effort into building it. Talk about low cost with meaning. Not only do you not have to build it, but the person that bought it and builds it loves you more because they built it. How is that for a personal relationship? It's absolutely genius. And so if you think of IKEA, it is so many series of intimate spaces that you encounter by the time you leave. And that is a floor plan, that is a kind of blueprint for another space that you're also familiar with. Shifting gears to this amazing invention called the Apple Store. The Apple Store, how many people have been there? It's ridiculous, we've all been there. But when you remember your first visit to the Apple Store? You're like this. What is it? This is an advice room? What am I, college? What's going on here? You don't even know. And why? Because of this genius. Here he is, Ron Johnson. Everyone gives Steve Jobs credit, but it's this guy. This is Ron Johnson. He was vice president of retail operations at Apple. He says, well, first, let me just say something about him before I read the quote. So before his job at Apple, he worked at Target. Do you guys have Target here?
We have
Hema. Okay. So in the United States, Target is the kind of competitor of Walmart, okay? But basically, unlike Walmart, they took on the IKEA thing where they were going to become Walmart with meaning. So Ron Johnson gets on board at Target, and he decides that what they're going to do is work with high-end designers to release designed products as part of their package. So you get these, these design editions that would come out every year. And they would become the chic Walmart. And it worked like crazy. So he gets famous for doing that to Walmart, for Target, where then people started calling it Target. And he comes over to Apple, and he says, people come to the Apple Store for the experience, and they're willing to pay a premium for that. There are lots of components to that experience, but maybe the most important, and this is something that can translate to any retailer, is that the staff isn't focused on selling stuff, it's focused on building relationships and trying to make people's lives better. That may sound hokey, but it's true. So when you walk into the Apple Store and you don't understand what's going on, that's intentional. Because what is the most important thing that Ron Johnson decided to do? Hide the cash register. Before Apple Store, every time you walked into a store, it was all geared towards one object, the point of sale. And you literally, it was designed so you would see it. There's the cash register. Why am I here? Because of that thing. But at Apple Store, you don't even see a cash register. You're unclear what's going on. It's only till you finally buy something and this receipt comes out from under the table that you're like, what the heck? I guess I just bought something. And that's because what they're developing is a civic space. Because once you realize that it's not for sale, at least you think, your space of vulnerability in your heart opens up. And what could be more vulnerable than one's anxiety about their phone or computer? You walk in there all confused, it's slowing down, the battery's not working, everything, and you're just like, hi, I'm nervous. But there's no cash register, and there's just a nice person in blue right there for you. And so this space of conviviality and affect is totally designed. And so this is in their guide, one example, and they have many, many, many of them, in order to make it understood that they are there to appease your anxiety and move it to sale. So the customer says, this Mac is just too expensive, because it is. I can see how you'd feel this way. I felt the price was a little too high, but I found it's a real value because of all the built-in software and capabilities. And this is affective programming that became a huge model, not only for Apple Store, but in fact for the entire retail chains across the board. Finally, it almost seems like everyone understands it, but let's just talk about them. Starbucks coffee. The genius behind this, I want to say also, these geniuses are not geniuses, by the way. They just understand where things are going. I don't want to give them too much credit. In 1983, the head of marketing, this guy Howard Schultz, that became the CAO, he goes to Milan and witnesses coffee culture in action. So he becomes CEO, and Starbucks goes from 2.6 billion in 2001 to 16.4 billion in 2014. What's amazing is he had the most stupid revelation that he put into action that made them tons of money. And what was that revelation? Coffee is social. So he goes to Italy, like many people, and he looks around, and he's in these cafes, and people are just hanging out, standing there, drinking, and it just clicked in him. He's like, coffee isn't a drink. Coffee is a drink as people talk to each other. Coffee is an elixir of sociality. And that elixir of sociality has a long history. And in fact, it has been that way forever. And in fact, I would say a lot of leftist movements would not exist without coffee. So this is an observation from a traveler from the 17th century about coffee shops in France. People engage in conversation, for it is there that news is communicated, and where those interested in politics criticize the government in all freedom and without being fearful, since the government does not heed what people say. Well, I like that kind of joyful. I mean, I'm a coffee addict. I love it. But Howard Schultz understood that you're not selling coffee, you're selling the social by way of coffee. You get it? Yes. And another thing they do that you're very familiar to is they say, what's your name? And then they write your name on the coffee cup. But they don't need to know your name. That is because they want to get on a one-on-one basis with you and see your name on their coffee cup so that your intimate space is in connection to their brand. And that is why they do it. So that when you hear Robert, you're like, yes, here Robert, and they smile at you and you think, oh, Starbucks, you know me so well. And that's the power. So in terms of the corporate civic, it seems all cynical and funny, but in the increasingly limited neoliberal space of the city, places to gather are fewer and far between. You know, our public parks, our beaches, our bars, the barber shop. The private space to gather is not just some mean-spirited thing to do. It's something that we all desire. We are not individual creatures. Evolutionarily, humans want to be together, to talk and be. And that makes us vulnerable, and corporate retailers know it. It's great. Okay, I'm switching gears to another one that's very fun. Charity and the image of doing good. By the way, I have a lot of chapters, so, you know, this is me selling you, effectively, I hope, on my book. Charity and the image of doing good. This is another chapter. Let's start with soup. Another liquid Is it a meal? You know, my wife says it's a meal. I'm always hungry after. Is it a meal? Anyways, so soup has always been associated with charity. And I think one of the most historically accurate and deep thinkers about soup is this man. This is Andy Warhol, who has a great quote about soup. He said, "I used to drink it. I used to have the same lunch every day for 20 years." Andy Warhol grew up in Pittsburgh during the Depression era. I'm sure he's actually being quite honest about that. And it wasn't just any soup, it was Campbell's soup, as we all know from art. But Campbell's soup, funny enough, got a lot of money through the Depression because they were the first ones to have preservatives in soup. And something that can last a while that sat on the shelf made them a ton of money. And I think it's interesting, I only say this because most people think that Warhol putting up the soup, I would never have come to this conclusion unless I wrote this book, I have to say. But I had another read on this image, which is when Warhol puts on this iconic image of the Campbell soup can, people thought it was just kind of some bland consumer product that is referencing pop culture and advertising. But I don't think it was that. I think it actually comes clearly from a deep personal relationship to that product. And not just some personal relationship, a personal relationship of poverty, of nostalgia, of homeliness, of family. All of that was wrapped up in that red and white iconic symbol. And soup, that image of charity, the things that Mother Teresa gives out, the things that people give out during Depression era, the things that different Red Cross agencies go and deliver in different kind of crisis-stricken areas, soup, that simple liquid meal, becomes an image of doing good for other people. In marketing, they have a name for that. It's called cause-related marketing, CRM. It's defined as a strategic positioning and marketing tool which links a company or brand to a relevant social cause or issue for mutual benefit. The consumers become benefactors. It enhances corporate image. It improves corporate credibility, and it produces a good attitude in the mind of buyers. I mean, I got to tell you something. You know someone's selling you something when they come with a win-win, but that's what you got with cause-related marketing. In the month of October in the United States, there's a new color that's been introduced to the season, and it's right here. It's a season of breast cancer awareness, and I say this out of deep respect and understanding that breast cancer is a giant tragedy and issue that needs to be resolved and thought through, and that cancer research is deeply important and it affects a lot of people. Breast Cancer Awareness Month is extremely popular. It got so ridiculous in the NFL that the umpires are wearing pink, the players wear pink, the fans wear pink. It's pink, pink, pink. Reebok makes pink, and eventually it wasn't just the National Football League of America that got into Breast Cancer Awareness Month. Kentucky Fried Chicken made buckets for the cure. Yoplait has Save Lids, Saves Lives. Tic Tac made pink Tic Tacs. And Mike's Hard Lemonade had a breast cancer awareness spiked drink for you. But it even got more crazy. The U.S. military made a breast cancer awareness fighter jet. And the Israeli military made a breast cancer fighter jet as well. And in fact, to come full circle, of course, so did Campbell's soup. Now, what's interesting about this is for all those selling cause-related marketing as it applies to breast cancer awareness, it is very much understood that the largest producer of home goods is the female market. And they were very interested, if you had a pink soup can versus the not pink soup can, which one do you think you'd buy during the month of October? Well, Campbell's Soup, funny enough, gave $20,000 to Breast Cancer Awareness Month, but mostly the cans were just pink. And the color pink in and of itself was considered enough to raise awareness. They're raising awareness around breast cancer. And many of the other products are doing the same. But we all understand that because we live in an era of cause-related marketing. The first kind of noted cause-related marketing campaign was this one, And this was by American Express, where every purchase through your American Express card would put money towards renovating the Statue of Liberty. So you could both be patriotic, you could stand up for immigrants, and you could spend your American Express card. Since then, we've seen a number of them. Of course, this is the Gap company's Red campaign, where you can fight HIV/AIDS while buying Gap clothes produced by sweatshops. So you can fight HIV/AIDS through sweatshops. But we're familiar with it, and rather than just be cynical, it becomes very tricky. Because certainly, I would imagine, in Artland, many of us want to do good for the world. And the slippery slope of how to do that becomes tricky. So the image of doing good is very powerful, versus it's so powerful that it's hard to resist. Next chapter. The insurgents. I know a lot of people say, okay, just for the record, and no offense to those that are into this, sometimes I say, well, I'm really interested in how the military uses art to get stuff done. And they say, yeah, I know, like in the Cold War, where the CIA had like abstract expressionism move around the place, promoting American goods. I'm like, oh my God, don't be so literal, no. Yes, they did that, but they did a lot more artful things than that on a far larger scale. And what I mean by that is, like I'm saying, the techniques of intimacy and affect deployed as a strategy to get people to do what you want to do is what I'm interested in. This chapter focuses, The Insurgents is actually a title of a book that is a biography of this man, General David E. Petraeus, who was the military commander in charge of the Iraq War in the second part during the surge, if you can put your head back. And David Petraeus got his name out there and interest in him because of his deep investment in the subject of counterinsurgency. This is what he defines counterinsurgency as, and this is the book he wrote that's called Field Manual 3-24. I don't know why art people don't write things like that. Art Manual 7-74. But this is how he defines counterinsurgency. Counterinsurgency is military, paramilitary, political, economic, psychological, and civic actions taken by the government to defeat insurgency. Oh my God, I misspelled that. Taken by government to defeat insurgency. He wrote this book, and a lot of his knowledge, and just to say, when he talks about counterinsurgency, what he's talking about, to be very simple, is when you move into a place to take it over and the locals try to throw you out. That is called counterinsurgency, as you can imagine. Well, a lot of his knowledge came from a book by this gentleman called David Galula, who wrote this book called Counterinsurgency Warfare, Theory and Practice. And David Galula was an officer in the Algerian War, a French officer in the Algerian War, who worked very much on the counterinsurgency there in the 50s. And he wrote, in relationship to his understanding of counterinsurgency there, he said, as they recognized the difference between their prospering environment and those surrounding areas still in the grip of hostiles, villagers were easily convinced of the need to preserve their peace by helping to prevent rebel infiltration. And the strategy in counterinsurgency is very simple, at least to say, which is you locate who the extremists are and you kill them. You locate who the not extremists are and you go and talk to them and meet with them and have meetings with them and make them your friends. You get it? And I always say this because many people think of this as warfare, but it's the same thing that governments do to immigrant communities, to communities of color, to many different strategies. You can actually apply this to a lot of techniques of power to deal with situations where violence is deployed or violence is a part of the narrative of social relationships. So here we are in the Algerian War of Independence. David Petraeus did a project, so the David Petraeus model that went into the Iraq War was called, wonderfully enough, Hearts and Minds. Do you guys remember this? It was called Hearts and Minds. So it was a Hearts and Minds campaign. And Petraeus was a big advocate of a few things. One is, rather than patrolling the streets in cars, the soldiers now had to walk around outside like a cop on the beat and get to meet people and get to know their names. They also often said throw money at problems, throw books at problems, have meetings, and kill people. These are the strategies of counterinsurgency. And so you saw this. And in fact, in some of the manuals, because also a lot of the counterinsurgency models that they learned from was the war in El Salvador and Nicaragua, which, I mean, this is all troubled waters because I don't mean to say any of these were successes. Every one of these was nightmares. I'm just interested in the techniques, so bear with me. And clearly, I'm not a fan of Petraeus. I feel lame saying it, but sometimes people are like, how can you be such a supporter of Petraeus? I'm like, no, I'm not. I'm just trying to say these are techniques of manipulation that are being used and have some effect. But in the war in El Salvador, there was a RAND study that was done that basically said, in order to win this war, I'm summarizing, what we need to do is borrow the platform of the left wing, which is we need to feed people, we need to clothe people, we need to give them education, we need agrarian reform. And in so doing, we need to then prop up the right-wing government that's killing people and doesn't want that. So there's an irony in all of that. But these strategies of counterinsurgency are very interesting because, I mean, I know you guys can think through this, but just to put it out there, how many community engagement projects are you familiar with that do these things? I mean, not the kill people part. Go and have meetings, ask people what they think, get feedback, go and have more meetings, get feedback. How many developers, in order to get stuff passed, go to the community, have these charrettes where they propose designs, put them in certain kind of conversations where people will feel better, but in fact the plan is already made and the feedback's going nowhere. You know what I mean? I mean, these are strategies of manipulation that are extraordinarily effective. And frankly, too, when you go and talk to people, they feel better about whatever you're saying because it's hard to resist the intimate. On a side note, Petraeus was so effective that then they took him, after being called the mayor of Mosul, they dubbed him the mayor of Mosul. They took his techniques to the Afghanistan war, and they developed a thing called the human terrain system. And okay, good. I'm going to do okay for time. That's good. I got to show you this video. I got to show this video. Okay. Okay.
Forward operating base Morales Fraser. The outpost of U.S. Marines and French paratroopers is surrounded by Taliban forces.
Stand over there, please.
John Green is preparing a military mission with an unusual objective.
Matt, stand over there for now, please.
He and Dr. Matt Arnold are part of a group of civilian social scientists called the Human Terrain Team, a key to turn the people here away from the Taliban.
Richard's going to ride in the lab. The cameraman, we're going to put in the VAB, and you're going to want to be...
For the next 18 hours, our crew will embed with them as they head outside the secure perimeter and to the front lines of the
Valley's going to be
conflict.
on the left. We want the gun on the left. We want you on the backside. Hey, y'all be careful. We'll see you out there. Roger.
The chances that the Taliban will attempt to strike this mission are high. They likely know Matt and John's destination, a highly publicized town meeting. The helicopter gunship sweeps the route ahead of the convoy, looking for signs of insurgent activity. On the ground, safely moving the 4-person human terrain team requires 30 armed soldiers and 7 armored vehicles. But the mission is critical. As part of an effort to win the hearts and minds here, the U.S. funded the building of a paved road. But the plan has backfired. The road construction has bulldozed homes. Villagers are now threatening to join the Taliban.
I mean, did you catch that for a second? They're like, I mean, that to me is demonstrative of the problem of the U.S. military doing hearts and minds. They're like, we're going to win over the community. We're going to build a road for them. Oh my God, you put the road right over their house? No, you got to go around the house. Oh no. All right, hold on.
The team must somehow make amends. Every village that goes to the Taliban provides a greater safe haven for their operations. The armored convoy takes the team most of the way. Here, Every move is a balancing act of security versus direct engagement with the locals.
All right, let's go. We're going to go down the block. We're going to go down, move.
The team makes the final leg of the journey on foot. Risky, but a vital part of building trust.
Well, this is our fourth time to come into this valley on a mission similar to this.
Well, it could go on. It's really interesting. I mean, I think for those doing community engaged art, it's like absolutely fascinating. But to get back to my talk, so first of all, the title "Human Terrain System" is something that I feel like Deleuze and Guattari would pass out about. It's treating subjectivities as a geography, and that is absolutely fascinating. So they literally, they go and build roads, and they're trying to win hearts and minds. But, just to give some context, the human terrain system was an idea proposed by one of the characters in this, one of the people in this show you just watched. And her name's Montgomery Mitzi McFate, who, as a shout out to my friend Jonas Stahl, who is a sick, amazing show about Steve Bannon. I think your next show should be about Montgomery Mitzi McFate, because she was a punk rock person who then got a PhD in anthropology and decided to use her PhD in anthropology as a weapon in the US military. And so the human terrain system is a funded thing by Petraeus, where they put actual PhD anthropologists in the field of Afghanistan in order to have a more culturally informed warfare that it would win hearts and minds. Does that make sense? Yeah. To this day, Petraeus swears it could have worked if they would have put just more money towards it. They obviously did not, and this whole thing fell apart. And as a side note about it, which is enjoyable, Montgomery McFate, which I think is like one of the most complex historical figures of the Afghanistan war, has this quote, first of all, that said, this is in an article she wrote after getting her PhD from Harvard. She said, "The retreat to the ivory tower is also a product of the deep isolationist tendencies within the discipline, and the discipline being anthropology. Following the Vietnam War, it was fashionable among anthropologists to reject the discipline's historic ties to colonialism. Rejecting anthropology's status as the handmaiden of colonialism, anthropologists refused to, quote, collaborate with the powerful, instead vying to represent the interests of indigenous peoples engaged in neo-colonial struggles." So what she argues, and this is her kind of realpolitik, obviously self-serving side too, because I'm sure she got paid a pretty penny to be the chief advisor and former of Human Terrain System, but that said, her argument was, academia has given up on power. They're no longer interested in it because they don't want to messy their hands with the powerful, and they won't take the real courageous step of having to actually deal with real world issues, rather having the kind of purity of their arguments intact so long as they're still totally politically irrelevant. That's her kind of argument. You get what I'm saying? So they'll say like, Marxist theory, good job, you guys write these great papers that no one reads and has no bearing on class struggle. This is the argument. And so she's like, I'm going to go take on power. And she says, I'm doing human terrain system because the US military is going to kill people anyways. They're going to Afghanistan. They're going to Iraq. If I'm in there with anthropologists winning hearts and minds, they're going to kill less people. That's her argument. You get it? Of course, she is vilified by the anthropological community. They say, you're weaponizing anthropology, you're using it against people. There's no way the US military will do this for anything other than capitalist American imperialist gains. I think that's a sound argument too. But this is the position that she puts out there. And this as a side note too, Montgomery Mitzi McFate had a pseudonym where she had a blog that she wrote online about how hot all the generals were in NATO. It was called, oh my God. It was called Man in a Uniform. Just to say, she's a very complex figure. From the Bay Area with hippie parents, as all the most difficult and complex and violent people are. So just to say, the human terrain system was ended. And they thought it was a giant waste of money. It was very controversial in the military. And in fact, the U.S. is still in Afghanistan. It's a total nightmare. No one even knows what the point is. So I don't want to get into that. But I am interested in these kind of systems. Okay, we're going to wrap up. one of the things that happened to me while writing this book, and I don't know, maybe we can have a confessional, which is sometimes I work on projects like Living as Form, and I guess that's a nice thing about projects, is I finish it and then I realize I don't agree with it at all. And you're like, well, that took 5 years. I'm still putting it out there. I don't care. And all I mean by that is, the thing that I realized at the end of the book was that it's actually more accurate than I thought. The realization is that the intimate and its vulnerabilities applies to everyone, myself included. And what I mean by that is, I became more and more convinced that I guess, a lot of us say like, oh my gosh, there's all those people out there that just don't get stuff and they're just easily controlled by advertising. But then I was like, it's not that. This is just how knowledge works. Knowledge is affect. And it's not them and us, it's all of us. We live in a world of all these deployments. In fact, it's so difficult to write the book because it's so self-evident. It's like telling a fish it's in water. But sometimes that's useful because not all fish know they're in water. They just think they're cruising around. Well, we're in the world of affect. And I know, you guys know, we have Trump, and I'm sorry. I feel like every time I come to Europe, I apologize. But what's amazing is we also see the anti-Trump world is also a world of affect. And we live in this synergistic relationship of everyone full of indignation and hostility, circling around like some giant, emotive, affective world of catastrophes and nightmares and desires and sex and all the things that are at the bottom of the pyramid, because guess what? That's what works, and that's what meaning is. So producing meaningful things is inevitably coercive, is what I think. That in fact, rather than thinking like it's powerful people manipulating you, the production of things that mean things to us is coercion. And all the more so with scale. Now this book was a look at the world from the top down. I don't mean top in terms of some normative claim. I mean top in terms of power and scale, like I mentioned. But I feel obliged at this point to reference back to my origins, which was looking at activists and artists resisting powerful forces. And of course, there's power in the powerless, quote unquote, and we've seen it all the time. And I also want to say, in terms of artists, there is refreshing news, because I became all the more convinced in something so very fundamental, which is the intimate is in fact powerful. That in fact, that is the language we speak, and art has more value than ever because it understood intuitively that knowledge is produced at that level. I hope some of the things we can take away from this is a few things. One is to appreciate the enormity of the issues we're confronting. Two is to build a more robust ability to speak across disciplines, that in fact art and life have a lot of connections. And then finally, I think what's important is to comprehend something very basic, which is we got to get our heads around this discursive rhetorical game of affect, because we actually do need speech and community to resist the conditions of power that are oppressing us, and that is our most urgent task. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Nato. Please take a seat if you like. Perfect. And then I would like to bring to the stage the two respondents of today. Jeanne van Heeswijk is a visual artist who creates context for interactions in public spaces. One of the topics in the book is social practices in art and community art, and I think you've been at the core of that in Rotterdam for a long time, or those practices here. So we're very happy to have you here. And the other is Merlijn Twaalfhoven. You are a Dutch composer working internationally in creating new and innovative projects with and writing new music for orchestras, choirs, and chamber music groups. You also work together often with groups of people, as I know, not just people who have knowledge of music, but also lack of training or professional training, and together creating musical experiences. Currently, you are working on a project or the development of something called the Turn Club, which is I translated it myself to English, so I translated it into a initiative to tackle societal issues via artistic perspectives. I hope that serves its right. Thank you both for being here. Please join us at the table.
If you guys want a few seconds to relax a bit, I propose to take 30 seconds. Like this. Yeah, usually it will be this disadvantage. People don't get anything. Yeah, exactly. Stretch. Let people leave, so now they can. Yes. They might come back after class.
Okay, let's go. Ja, hoe pak je ze in? Pak ze in? Yes. Okay, let's go. And Jeanne, for you, the floor. I can also take the floor. I would love to listen many more stories, because all of the anecdotes, of course, I recognize them a lot. One of the things that came to me as an artist, and also being here, I guess among a lot of artists, and you having that background, there was also something confusing me. Isn't affect part of life? Isn't that have been like always? Isn't that the essence of our being? Isn't it? It seems like it's maybe discovered by the corporate culture and the government and so on. The examples that you give, but in your talk and in the book, I feel some kind of indignation that they took away this key to the minds and hearts from the artists. They stole it. And I felt like, isn't that the artist to blame? Weren't the artists in some way in the 20th century really stepping up to become part of this mentality of the market? Not so much as making money. No, don't get me wrong, but it's more a scarcity mindset, that when things are unique, when things are, well, scarce, when they're exclusive, when they're rare, well, they have a high value. And did artists compete for that status, this attention, the scarcity of attention, to compete to be on the stage? My background is classical music, and you know the time on the stage is very precious, it's very rare. The fact that people come together and are listening to you, you have to fulfill that scarce slot of time. The fact that you're selected to give a performance in this temple, like the Concertgebouw or the music places. But before the temple was built, well, classical music was not scarce at all. It took place in social clubs. People came together to play music. And it was everywhere. It was not professionalized. People didn't do that as a profession. People couldn't imagine being a professional artist. No, that was just part of life. It's how you celebrate, how you connect. So for me, I have the feeling that indeed there was an amazing connection between the richness of artistic imagination, the fact that artists could play, that they could, well, create space of beauty, and they put all their craftsmanship into that expression of beauty. I mean, that's amazing. And a lot got lost in the last 100 years. But wasn't that this artist who wanted to succeed on the market, in the world of scarcity? Wasn't that the big tragedy?
Well, I mean, you know, I do think I definitely don't think it's the fault of artists, to put it out there. I mean, to go to your point, though, it is important to recognize, I didn't get into this, but, you know, it's important to recognize the mechanisms by which affect is delivered. It's, you know, it's certainly embodied by something as simple as this, but it's more than that, you know, it's TV, but also cultural platforms. I mean, you could say culture is what we have for dinner and lunch and breakfast, and we're actually more like hobbits. We got like onesies and, you know what I mean, they got all those other food times, but we eat all day long, so we're kind of like binge eating culture. I think they call it binge watching. I know, everyone's like, yeah, but Netflix is totally great. But what I mean by that is, it's not, I think it is that this desire for culture is big, and I don't want to blame artists for it. And simultaneously, what I think is important to recognize is, in terms of difference, you know, means ends is an important conversation to have, which is, while the means are very similar, the ends can often be very different. You know, and what I mean by that is the experience of the Apple Store is actually very transparent in terms of its ends. It's to get you to buy Apple products. But what I like about artistic processes is the ends are not always so clear. And to go to your point too, sometimes the cynical version is, well, we know what the artist wants. They want what everyone else wants, to be famous and to make some money, and they're just using their art as an alibi for that. But I would say that, you know, it's not always that case, and also too that viewers are more discerning than that there's more nuance, that projects can have multiple agendas packed into one thing. So I do think that, in fact, there is nuance there that's extreme. In fact, I would say, if anything, the differences are the most urgent, right? Like, where is the space by which I am not like the U.S. military? Where is the space, you know? And for artists, you know, and also I think, to go to your thing about social capital, right? The role of artists using the arts to get ahead, right? It's important to have on the table, because neoliberalism and scarcity and precarity are deeply, fundamentally related to all our lives, and particularly cultural production. But I don't think that makes it the end of the story. It's just something we must recognize as a major ingredient in the cultural production narrative.
Well, you mentioned that we have a desire for culture all day long. I think that's also, for me, I'm wondering what you mean with that, because I can imagine we have a desire to belong somewhere, or we have a desire to feel alive. And these type of desires I can picture, but the desire for culture is, for me, I cannot get it. I do feel, however, that the desire to belong somewhere, there were clear answers, and then I take you a few hundred years ago, of course, the church or the community, celebrations, things that were part of seasons or of places, so time or space, that they had meaning. It meant something to start a new year or to celebrate Easter. So there is a desire to connect to those elements, and now those elements are, well, monetized. There are clever people who make a living by hacking those desires and translating it into a product. That, I think, it's cruel. It's something that we have as a human being. Well, we were there when it happened, you know? We let them do it, them.
I mean, just to say, just to problematize that, I don't think we let them do it. We are doing it. Like, that's the difference. I don't think like, and also too, I just think like, it's a refined technique of strategies that understand the affects the way we work. In so much as, you know, an artist that develops a public park will design it to produce affect. You know what I mean? It will be intentional. And, you know, the churches forever were designed to produce affect. But that said, the amount of people working on design on a strategic level, there's just a lot more of that. So I don't want to what I mean is I want to get away from the, this is something I just really want to get away from, the kind of like them, us narrative, because I feel like it obscures what's truly happening. And I say that because I find this, particularly as a person that does a lot of activist stuff and is really invested in kind of social movements, particularly in this vast age of economic inequality, I think it's very misleading for the left to constantly point that it's the right that's doing it. Because often I found the left belongs to a left just because they want to be part of a community. And we speak in code because we want to belong and fight for good things. But the nuance dies about there.
Like I was thinking, and we spoke a little bit about this before together also, like that, you know, that there are the certain toolkits that are in operation, are toolkits that are used at both sides, let's say it like that, but with what you say in different ways, with different scales of operation. And that's something that I find very interesting, this thinking about the relationship between intimacy and scale. Because the way that certain of these examples that you give are so effective, not affective, is that they are on a large scale, but they also work with like sort of scripted behavior. And with a particular idea of, you could say, a colonial mindset of what we want people to like. It's winning hearts and minds for what we think is important. So it's like, it is about scale and scripted behavior. And I think what is interesting, especially at this moment in time, if you think about like forms of counterinsurgents, if you want to call it, from an art perspective, is like, how can we break scale? In effective way. How can we actually create intimacy? And I think, for instance, the relating to Starbucks, to just think of a few examples, is like lately in Philadelphia, the two people of African Americans who were actually arrested in Starbucks for basically sitting and waiting for a friend. So exactly doing what this place promises. Right. So, and I think sort of like, I think that is a very interesting moment, like you could say, where these spaces actually reveal that true, you could say, that true production of meaning. Yeah. So I think it is important to think how we can actually fracture that scale. So I'm not so afraid of scale, I want to say. Yeah. I think like, I would think about like, how can we effectively think of more ways in actually fracturing scale? And in your book, you refer to this idea of the happening. Yeah. I think that's something you mentioned, where you say the happening was actually a way to maybe not be inscribed within the system. And I know that there are also some people here, but lately I think we should, in terms of counterinsurgents, also thinking about not so much about tools, but about trainings, different ways of fracturing actually scale. I think that's extremely important when it comes to intimacy.
I really appreciate that. You know, Mao Zedong said, people are the sea that revolution moves through. And, I mean, he is the writer on counterinsurgency. But he understood, you know, better than Gramsci did, the power that culture has. And when you talk about fracturing scale, I love that phrase. It's so good. Because, you know, I've seen it too. You know, I feel very bad because I feel like the book is inherently cynical because the topics are they're just tough. They're really tough. And also when you confront, you know, when you hear that IKEA consumes 7% of the world's wood, it's hard for an artist in undergrad to not go, but what about me? You know? And I do think it's good to have techniques of the fracturing of scale, to understand that these are disruptible systems. And to go to happenings, you know, I also think of this idea of an unscripted encounter. In some ways it brings home just how absolutely important the non-endsness of art is, right? To go to almost Dada, right? To go to the power of the irrational as a political space to upset conditions of control. Now that said, I want to be careful because just like the Apple Store where there's no cash register, sometimes the museum can often be just like an Apple Store where they're like, it's totally irrational, it's totally great. And you're like, it's just power demonstrating itself. Don't get too crazy. So I think like we have to be like, refined in our view of that.
not, well, let's say, not being functional, not having a clear perspective, not having a clear goal. I think that's one of the most powerful things of art. It stepped actually in a void after religion, because religion could create space for the things that we could not understand with our mind. Supernatural things, they were not explained, but they got a space, like a ritual inside. They could exist. You could say, I don't know, but it's there. It could be recognized. And the unknown today, I think, we have a big, let's say, a campaign against the unknown for past 100 years. The unknown is we have to not talk about it. We have to ignore it. Of course, big mysteries like what happens after death. Where do we come from? There is no ways to address it, so people feel very awkward at funerals or around birthdays. So I believe art could step there, addressing the unknown. But actually, this is a huge thing that is part of everybody's life. So again, it is the fact that artists created their own place and that we also define art, like today in this building. I think that is really a mistake.
But you know, it's funny because so I think there's some strategic things. So when you talk about the unknown, like for example, the rise of the right and like a lot of immigrant bashing and xenophobia, people mistake the agenda. And I say it this way, like for example, in the United States when Trump was coming up in office and everybody was like, and they were like, love, not hate, right? I always thought, my God, that's the worst thing. Or they say love conquers hate. And I think if you talk to any political consultant, they would be like, no, hate will win. Like love's never beat hate, just for the record. Hate's much stronger. Hate wins. You're just never going to beat hate with love on a PR campaign. But you know what the opposite of hate really is? Tuna fish. What I mean is, the opposite of hate is a non sequitur. It is not literally the effective opposite of hate. And so, you know, because what happens is with these kind of like lame interpretations of reading fear narratives, is you fall into these cycles where like, if you put in this, if the opposite of hate was love, you fall into the same kind of news strategies that like Rachel Maddow is the answer to Trump. No, Rachel Maddow is not the answer to Trump. Rachel Maddow is making money off a right-wing agenda driving a certain kind of fear narrative in television. Do you know what I mean? And I think a lot of left-wing politics depends deeply on the politics of the right to prove their agenda, rather than switching the subject and producing an entirely other narrative. Does that make sense? Because I feel like in the world of affect, you cannot be so literal about the power of affect. Fear, you know, Nixon, and it is very much related to race. You cannot talk about the power of race in the world without literally talking about the ways in which affect and people's desires to tribe up and be against the other, the fearful other, and its ways that it works with mass technologies like radio, internet, film. Like those are inherently related. But the way you combat that is you actually switch the narrative entirely altogether and produce new forms of subjectivity. By the way.
No, but I think like it's sort of interesting that you bring up producing new forms of subjectivity, because I think then we have to say about like, okay, how are we going to do that? Like in a recent article, Marina Garcés, was called Honesty with the Real. She said like basically thinking about subjectivity as breaking oneself in order to actually approach the other. So breaking oneself would be actually putting insertion on yourself in order to create maybe new forms of subjectivities. And this means actually like not thinking about or thinking differently about images of success, I think, or what we success like, but also it means actively breaking own subject positions. And I think this is very important to think, because like this can only be possible, I think, if we practice, let's say, on a very small scale. You cannot do that on a large scale. So I think if we not radically actually let go of this idea of scale as a driving force, like, and really think like, no, we have to take another sense of urgency in scale, and that scale can be on the intimate, but also on the intimate of like the individual in relation to others and the breaking of the subject position. I think we're always going to end up in this like, but they are bigger than us, you know. And I am like a person. I like I always said, you know, that I'm a believer. So like I believe that small scale. In small scale acts, like I wouldn't like, like to talk about acupuncture, acts of acupuncture or urban acupuncture. Small scale acts can create new flows of belonging, new flows of subject positions, and I think we have to work at that. So like I am like, again, I'm just like, let's then talk about what these new subject positions need or are, or where we find them, or what we need to do for them.
Well, you know, it's interesting because like, we were talking earlier too, like, I mean, this came to me earlier, but it's related, which was like, I was like, your politics are not what you say, it's how you live. And particularly, I was like, who you hang out with. And I'm like, if you're one of these white people that has all these progressive values, but all your friends are white, you gotta look in the mirror and be like, what am I doing? I'm like an asshole. And then I think like, what's up with that? But that's common, right? And then I think, what is this about like breaking up your subject, like, you know, to be more real with your own politics and not what you say or what you write a PhD about, like what you do, you know, how do you spend your intimate time? What are those micro spaces? Not like in some sort of self-flagellating way, but I think the refreshing thing is they're totally changeable. You know, you can do that, you can break up those flows pretty quick. You know, you can just get on up in the morning and be like, I got a project called my life. But it's just, it's rather than taking on IKEA. And I also thought, you know, I hate therapies, although I probably could use it. But like, I was thinking like, you know, like the Situationists where they had that, the Naked City, you know, and they had that fun phrase, which is like, if you want to change the world, don't see a therapist, reorganize your entire city. Well, that's kind of how I think about like life, which is our political movements. Like, if you want to change a city, restructure the social relationships that are happening in your city.
Oh yeah, and we know maybe that there is 3% needed from the population. So you need 3% dedicated people to start a revolution. I mean, that's how they define it. So that's not scale, but it is. You need a way, because 3%, it's not alone. And there is for me, a big dilemma around the art world, and especially, well, you're building a space for artists. If you invite an artist that is someone with a name, and you put that name in the spotlight, and all the times when I felt I made a performance and someone gave me like a tap on the shoulder, I felt it was a way to say goodbye. They say like, oh, well done, but they had no way to actually connect, like, let's work together or build something together. It was just like, okay, that was nice. And isn't the way we organize our whole thinking of art is a way to focus on authors and to exclude that and make them like, avoid any stickiness. I mean, it's like you cannot grasp them because the artist is independent and goes their own way and has their own autonomous mind and so on.
Yeah, I think like, maybe I don't believe in the artist like that, so let's say it there. But I think like also I think it's a bit too easy or too cutting too short corners to say like, yeah, we have to organize our life, because like when I think about that, what we have to do is fracture scale. We have to do that, or we need to do that in a landscape that is fractured. Because it's not about just finding the right friends, let's say it like that, or getting on with your life. It is actually also, I think, still like working towards decolonizing, let's say, where we are right now, and trying to find other ways of imagining a possible future or possible futures. So how do you fracture scale in a fractured landscape? So how do you create new avenues of connectivity without necessarily going for pre-described behaviors of comfort? So that intimacy and comfort are, for instance, always going hand in hand. So like how do we do with that? Because like that was also interesting on the Starbucks thing, is that actually the discomfort that the guys were bestowed upon them was actually a tool that broke some of the conversation. Yeah. So like how are we fracturing scale in a fractured landscape and also not go for a relationship, the soul, let's say, marriage between intimacy and comfort.
It's such a good
like
point.
that's really important.
Absolutely, because I was thinking you could do Sorry. No, I was just thinking it's so good because the next book could be called Techniques of Intimacy or something to that effect, because it's a very good point that people confuse the intimate with easy, or to go to your point, comfort. And particularly around, I think, a lot of these structures, power gets along best with other forms of power. But disempower, or spaces of narrative that are gaps, are not enjoyable and thus produce friction, which is often not the way people are accustomed to aggregating in groups or social structures. And so it is an extraordinarily important point on a variety of levels. I mean, Bourdieu talks about all the time where he's like, it's not just money, it's also like people don't talk the same. They don't share the same jokes. Like if you're like, I'm not racist, I just hang out with people that like my jokes, you'll end up being racist. Like you have to have gaps. You have to appreciate spaces of non-communication, of differences of subjectivity. So I mean, I think your point is totally great, because I'm at the same time, well, I mean, obviously, I was being simplistic for the sake of whatever. We could get into how to produce, well, that's what you do, is like hang out with people and have weird conversations that are productive.
Yeah, but I think that idea of thinking basically about the fact that if we think about sense of intimacy and sense of belonging, which comes up, then we also have to think about how is belonging constructed, and how is that constructed in territories that are fractured. So like I think that is something, so like Lorenzo Mondaro says also, like, how do we think about a group when we do not know the group yet? How do we think about becoming a community, or becoming in a sense of relationality, if we do not know who that will be? So if it's not with direct intimacy, but if it is in a larger construction, so how do we do that?
Well,
so
can
like,
I ask something just as a challenge?
Yeah.
So, it's funny because we're all falling into something that is my go-to fall into thing too, which is, so you talk about scalable intimacies. So we talk about the U.S. military, we talk about corporations, and then we immediately fall back to low-scale intimacies, right? And I'm just going to ask, is there nothing one can learn? Is there no benefit of scale?
If scale only is about coercion and like luring people into an already preset mindset, or with a pre-inscribed idea about what the future looks like, I am just totally not interested in.
Don't you think just a second. So like, let's go to Montgomery Mixed Fate, right?
Yeah.
Where she's like more realpolitik. And she's like, yeah, you say that, but you're going to lose. Which is to be kind of tough. You say that, but you're going to lose. The people that take on the fact of the matter is democracy, governments, life is not a sweet story of everyone doing good. People are going to lose. You have to have casualties. That's just the nature of democracy and power. If you really, as like Mao said, power comes out of the barrel of a gun. Like, do you want to deal with reality, or do you want to just have ethical purity?
Neither nor, I think. I think dealing with like what Marina says, honesty with the real is also to be real about it. So like I do not think that that it makes sense to fight on that scale, not anymore. I do think, and I see that in my work and everywhere I go, I see people creating small-scale change, people fighting, power, doing that, and I believe that it's more about like practicing and training together, training skill sets of resisting, and I think like this is not creating a mass, but it's like netting up small-scale forms, small-scale practices, small-scale learnings. So scale doesn't necessarily have to come with masses also. It can also come through netted forms of learnings and resistance, which I think is important to think about that. And I think also like sometimes is to also just make a choice, and like we spoke about it, and I had to afterwards think about it because you said like, you know, like the budget of the military, but also like, you know, like it's with violence. But I think even thinking at some point about the importance of breaking or of violence within, let's say, small-scale forums is important to think about as well.
But don't you find, I mean, you know, one of the things I'm very excited in the United States is right now people are very invested in the elections. And so there's actually, you know, I grew up with every activist I knew being like, doesn't matter either way, they're both part of the neoliberal austerity plan, don't worry about the elections. And then we got Trump and everyone's like, okay, maybe a little bit, worry a little bit about elections. But what I mean to say is, so there was a real, I'm talking about art culture, there's a real allergy to scale and compromise.
Well, can you...
It's not the kind of scale. I think because I am not afraid of scale, but you see it, but I don't think that just creating scale homogeneously makes sense. So I think we should fracture the notion of scale, but we should do that big. Yeah. Like we don't do that small, but we should do that big. But that's not the same as just, you know, like copying the scale that's already there. That doesn't make sense at all, because that we will lose anyway.
The biggest hotel chain, it's not Hilton, but it's impossible to build with concrete the biggest hotel chain because it's Airbnb. And I suggest a turn in thinking because Airbnb, it's small scale, it's your own like spare bedroom or your own apartment when you're on holiday, and still it's massively grown.
Oh my God, if I could have gone back and done a share economy chapter.
Well,
that's totally like, that's right there.
I believe that every one of us, and if I say us, I also point at the other, neighborhoods, and every one of our human being, there is an artist mindset hidden there. And there is the revolution. If we can create or give space for art seeing, art thinking, and art doing, among every one of us. And as an artist, you have a very important role to fulfill because you can, well, help. You invested these 10,000 hours in becoming an artist. So there is an important role, but not to occupy the stage, but to show the stage and to give others the space and or the tools to really, well, revive this artist mindset, and then we have a revolution.
Nato, maybe, or do you really want to respond? Exactly, yeah, that was my point.
It disappeared out of my head.
Yeah, so let's open it up this stage to the audience. I'm guessing there are a bunch of questions already. Otherwise, I will have one. But I'd like to share it immediately with you because we have about 20 minutes left. Are there any first reactions to what's being discussed now? Perfect. Sophia.
Hi, thank you very much for the lecture and the very lively discussion. I have a question that pertains, I'm very surprised by the fact that you haven't addressed the word even of representation. And I think that this relates to not only the question of scale, which can also be temporal, like a question around temporality, whether it's scale, ritual, intensity, a long-term, short-term, event-based presence, which would be, say, a monument. But as it pertains to representation, I think that this is one of the ways in which we could rethink the proposal of can we think about the means and not necessarily the ends? And I think that that is where the point of the IKEA comes back. Yes, it's less expensive, right, or low cost, and more meaningful. So to me, the question around the scale is one around really the ends. Because in the projects that you've done, I don't know your work in person, but the number of projects that NATO has done, and I think that this is indicative of the question of scale, is that he has given, or the projects have given, a huge platform to works that have very little to no presence within not only the mainstream, within the arts sector at large. So it is a question of scale. When you do a humongous sculpture that people, by the way, love, and hence, the fact that a huge sculpture at the Boymans is much more popular than a small painting in a gallery. So to me, the question would be, why is it that you, in this question around means and ends, you haven't addressed the question of representation as an end within the context of infiltration and all that?
Well, it's a very good point. And like I said, the book is from the vantage point of power. And so I do address representation. It just happens to be all white people. And what I mean by that is power is a lot of white people in the United States. Obviously, like this conversation is going, in this room, the topic we want to address is how do we uproot those flows, which you're talking about, right? So, and I appreciate that. Yes, of course. And, and maybe, if I'd done a talk about living as form, for example, there's a lot of conversation around representation in that. Certainly my own practice is very much invested in conversations about representation. I'm not sure if David Petraeus is, or Steve Jobs is. In fact, we know it's not. But to go to that, because I think it's important what you brought up, and it was really like, whoa, right, such a good point. I'm such a fan of scale. I mean, I'm building a museum, I like scale. And like you mentioned, I did a project with this artist, Carol Walker, which is in this refined sugar factory, and it was this giant sugar monument. Have you guys heard of this thing? Anyway, it's the most famous thing I ever worked on. I felt like I worked on like my platinum album of like public art. But I even had Usher call my assistant and ask to go backstage. And I was like, there's no backstage. It's public art. It's free and open to the public. But just to say, that's an African-American artist that got a giant amount of scale, literally, and budget. And certainly I do think of also the museological space as a vector of scale to legitimate different narratives. And that is, in fact, an important strategy of upending white power. And also transparently. I mean, I'm very transparent. Like, it's important to have not just a mixed race program, because then it's not about race, it's also about different subjectivities, upending of one subjectivity, but simultaneously staff and board, and that's another story altogether. But I do think that, so I am extraordinarily, within the arts institutions, a believer of scale, and furthermore, in federations of scale, in so much as I'm all for teaming up, and we can do that, let's all do it. I'm building a museum, so if you guys want to build the Upend the Flows Federation of Rad Art Projects across the globe, I'm game on.
But is it Hilton Group or Airbnb?
What's that?
Hilton Group, the buying all other, well, that's a federation.
Well, that's a franchise. Yeah. They're related. Yeah. Should I?
Hi. So I have a question through optics. So like looking at this entire talk, which is from like the perspective of Europe, looking at America, I just feel like I'm bringing a slightly different angle to it, that in the sense, it's very interesting that you showed like a gradient of the physiology at the bottom and everything. So that has been appropriated actually from the entire chakra system of well-being from Eastern cultures. And basically that entire pyramid talks about the power of individuation. I mean, that is the mechanics of how power of individuation works. So in that sense, I feel like this talk that you gave is very much around the power of creativity. And in that sense, like, I understand that the lens that you're looking at this entire talk today is very much from contemporary art and artists in relation to the world, but I just feel confused, like, in the sense that if we remove the word art and replace it with creativity, especially if we are using this icon as a reference point, it just makes me think that like, in that sense, the scale that we're talking about is that all of us, like, creativity is of course used in every single avenue in the world that wants to expand beyond itself using the tools of the unknown. So in that sense, instead of, like, you know, I understand that you're really feeling very passionate about the gatekeeping and the structures within the art world, but if we remove art and actually claim creativity within the arts, in that sense, firstly, there's a massive scale of population called the majority world that is actively engaging with the changes and breaking down of the power structures. So there is an entire part of the world that does actually on a daily basis try to create, like, intimate connections within industries and fields to actually do what we're trying to talk about here. So that's very interesting, is like, how do you apply these same concepts? How do you take, you know, neoliberalism and capitalism to majority world and see what IKEA is doing there? And then the last thing I want to say is that, like, yesterday I just got an invitation from a city in India where basically software engineers have bypassed the art world and they just hired a gallery and made a group show with themselves and are selling their paintings and have just completely bypassed the art world. So this is the kind of conditions in the developing nations of how the whole thing is flipped. So in that sense, like, how do you apply these kind of things to what's happening in neighborhoods around in Rotterdam, where people are actively engaging with creativity to create intimate, effective sort of systems within which they are sort of adjusting within the larger system, which has, like, a lot of, like, epistemic limits, etc.
Well, I mean, like I said, I mean, first of all, I'm very aware, you know, the book does not necessarily depend on art to exist. I really just think it's, you know, I think it's fine that everyone's creative, and I have no problem with that, and I believe that. I think, you know, honestly, I think that iterates out no problem, and I'm totally convinced. I mean, you know, I think it's not true that many of these forces learned from the art world. I think many of these ad execs never looked at the arts at all. I think they just come up with this stuff. I don't think you need to study art to come up with good art ideas. I mean, I'm convinced of it. So, you know, there's plenty of advertisement campaigns that are very successful that appeal to your emotions that haven't looked at an art book in their life. So I think people are very creative, you know, and so I have no qualms with that. In terms of the global perspective on it, I mean, like I said, I'm just looking at power, and I do think these are just techniques of power. These are not necessarily things that are unrelatable to small scale either. I think, you know, it's not me to say, but it's certainly a political question of how these things tease out in terms of communities and subjectivities and power.
You mentioned it's maybe talking about water and we are fish. I had a feeling that artists started to sell bottles of water and were proud there, and then suddenly companies took over and the artists feel like, whoa, they're so big, they have scale, they're selling much more successful. And I feel the revolution is that everyone's recognizing that you don't need to buy the water, but it's everywhere. That's what I want to do.
Who's next?
A question for Nato, and it would be, I'm very curious about the type of critical space that you're inhabiting. I wonder if you could define it. What I mean by it is that very often we tend, and this is a big mistake, to define things in binary terms, sort of like as an artist or as a critical thinker, let's say, things tend to be depicted as either you are engaged or you are a cynical. And I feel that you are sort of like playing around with the possibility of other options, of other categories, critical categories that are out there, and I wonder if you could define it.
I appreciate that. Well, that was very insightful. I am totally lost in the wilderness of these ideas. I certainly have a background in critical Marxism. I have my suspicions around the culture of critical Marxism. I believe fine that, I came to realize something really simple, which is Marx is a capitalist, for the record. There's nothing inherently anti-capitalist about Marx. And in fact, Marx has no problem with capitalism. Marx is totally enamored with capitalism. So when people say they're a Marxist, it doesn't mean they're anti-capitalist. You could totally be a Marxist business owner, no problem. In fact, some of the greatest business owners are Marxists. So what critical space am I inhabiting? I do think one of the things I'm invested in just in terms of teasing out these narratives is, it is a journey, and I'm open-ended in terms of my thoughts on it. I spend a lot of time thinking about oppression, about equal rights, so I do have an investment in that personally. I also spend a lot of time in the whatever community you would call the critical left global art thing, but I also have my ambivalences about it. I have ambivalences about my own urgencies. So I want to think through it. So I'm being very open with you. I do not, at the end of this book, there's implications, and there are strategies that I think are useful, but I also think politically there's a lot of open-ended questions. So when I'm pushing Jeanne about scale, it's because Jeanne is already saying what I want to, she's saying what I believe in, so I want to push her because I'm not totally convinced, right? Like I am torn that maybe these strategies of art aren't effective, And I am torn at times that artists are more self-serving. And at other times, I'm totally enamored with the projects we're all doing. And I'm really excited by it. So, the critical space is a kind of deep investment in trying to find some answers. I hope that helps.
So we do have perhaps time for a last question or two. There's the first one and a second one. I'll remember you.
I would like to respond to Jeanne's proposition about the idea of breaking scale to create new subject positions, because I think it's very fascinating. And I got the feeling that while you were elaborating on it, you were proposing to break scale, but you were not denouncing the idea of scale. So I thought, is it possible to understand it as the difference between mass and the moment of breaking scale? Then we were talking about critical mass. So it's not a rejection of the idea of mass power. It's a rejection of the idea that homogeneity will be the driving paradigm for which power is formulated. And I think it's extremely important that if I'm correct, and you're nodding, so I presume I'm on the right track, I think it's extremely important that you're saying that, because it's also about avoiding the idea that you can replicate power to fight it. Or at least that you can replicate power if you want to fight its inherent oppression, because in that moment you would, so okay, that's extremely interesting. And in that line, I think that what you're saying is very important in relationship to NATO's talk, because are you, NATO, not actually trying to articulate a contemporary notion of a popular or emancipatory power?
This is so great. It's so funny, just as a related thing. So if we want to talk about so we could talk about on a really basic level, to go to tie Sophia's question to DM25, what is it, DM15, 25, which number? 25? I can forget, I'm sorry. But let's talk about representation DM25, right? Me and you were talking about that, right? So everyone's we're going to upend this we're going to upend the narrative capital, but it's all white people, right? So then you were saying it's working on representation. But what I mean to say, and to go to yours too, it's what conditions of scale are we working on, right? And also, too, in the arts world, when people are we're going to produce a counter-narrative, what forms of power in your counter-narrative spaces are replicating existing conditions of power? gender, sexuality, race, to go through the kind of categories. But there's other ones we don't even know forms of power that are existing inherent in systems. So I just, I'm throwing it back to you, Jonas, because I think I'm very excited by the desire to produce scalable power, is so long as there's structures in place to constantly self-question without being self-defeating, the ways in which those systems are already replicating new forms of power.
My question goes to either Jeanne or Nato. I'm just wondering if, according to your opinion, do you think that artists who work within the realm of community-based art or participatory art with non-art makers, do you think it's important for them to measure the impact of their work, or is the intention as an artist sufficient?
Jeanne, do you have any kind of metrics of success in your projects?
Yeah, I think it's a very interesting question. It's a very complex question as well, because I think what I think is very urgently within some of the work that I try to do is think about different images of success. So also thinking of different ways to think about impact. And things, so measuring impact becomes a tricky one, because it's measuring impact for whom, or for what reason. So if we think about creating different images of success, we have to also question what we think is impactful or what we think is valuable. So it's also fundamentally questioning the value sets we operate. And scale is a value set, I would say. So in that sense, I think Jonas articulated it more nice than I did, but this idea of thinking also about how we can be together without necessarily already imagining the scalableness of our being together, but also the effectiveness or the impact of us being together. So this sounds weird, because if you want to work towards change, if that's a thing, then you have to operate these different sort of relationalities of actually allowing things to come into being, allowing confronting value sets without necessarily already pre-inscribing its impact. And that's what I find a problem with the scalability of the power we talk about in your examples, is that they already pre-inscribe not only the value set, but also the outcome and the way in which we want to be together. So if we want to try to find another way, if we want revolution, then it cannot be just by organizing masses, but it's by organizing critical, netted workings or trainings, if you want. So that I think is important. And for that, I think we as artists have to do a very important exercise, and that is also decolonizing our own imagination about what we think is valuable and how we treasure and how we see value, and especially if it comes to scale. And this is a quote I want to give, because it's also about talking about representation and presentation, that I don't know if people know her, but Walida Imarisha wrote in a book about thinking about future possibilities of revolution and utopia. She said the decolonization of the imagination is the most dangerous and subversive form there is, for it's where all forms of decolonization are born. Once the imagination is unshackled, liberation is limitless. And I like that quote a lot, because it says what we actually need to do as an exercise is to exactly question what we think is not only affect, but also effect, and what kind of value sets we keep operating when we try to organize whatever scale. So and that's what I find, that was my question. Yeah. So that's why I would say fracture scale. Although I understand duration, I understand embodied movement as a way of organizing scale, or even temporality as a sense of scale, but we have to keep in mind with what kind of like organizing principle, we are doing that. So we have to think about form as well in that sense.
Just a quick follow-up anecdote. I did a project with this artist, Paul Chan, in 2007 called Waiting for Godot in New Orleans. And it was a large community organizing project where we worked with the Classical Theater Harlem to put a production of Samuel Beckett's Waiting for Godot on 2 years after Hurricane Katrina in the lower Ninth Ward in this other neighborhood called Gentilly in New Orleans. As part of that, leading up to that, there was a broad-scale community organizing effort led by Paul Chan that we engaged on. And Paul had a very interesting measure of success because he had one very specific one, which was he had a very elaborate diagram, as you do, of people to meet. Go and knock on lots of doors. He, in fact, said, we're going to organize this project like Hezbollah, which I thought was pretty fun. And so we met with a lot of people, and we met with a few people that particularly hated the project. And this one woman who has been doing all this organizing hated it really severely and had a lot of good reasons to hate it. And he came away from that meeting and said, if we can get her to show up, we've done good. And she became his barometer of success because he felt that her subjectivity was such that she would only come around if it met all kinds of different categories, many of which he would have to figure out. And so I was thinking about that because I thought that's an interesting way to think through things, is that sometimes, it's wrong to think there's the community out there and there, but also to use other humans that work in conditions that hold you accountable, and you have to work to produce a methodology with them that meets their needs. I thought that was interesting. Because it was like literal as opposed to super abstract, Because sometimes they're like, I just feel it in my gut. And he was more like, if she feels it in her gut, then it'll work.
I could say something to that.
Please do, yeah.
It's again this process of like convincing and coercion. So like if she shows up, it worked. So like because she disagreed with me, so now she sort of agrees with me, or she extends sort of like her disagreement into some kind of curiosity.
She's smart enough, and he's thought, this is the way he reads it, she's smart enough, more radical enough that she would not show up unless it met these things.
Yeah, but that's exactly where I think like it would be amazing if she would show up when it didn't matter things, and actually to take it apart and take it away. So like again, Well,
I know, but at the same time, I disagree with you because yours is really vague. Like, how do we check yours?
Not.
Yeah, I know. So we gotta just trust you. It worked.
No, I think I think it's also like exactly that idea of actually like sort of what I call creating different images of success. So like actually not actually wanting that as a criteria to meet. Yeah. So it's to refusal. I think like we should have more conscious refusal of like the way in which we operate, is consciously refuse also certain ways in which we measure.
Well, fair enough. I mean, actually, too, I'm not saying like that's my model for doing it. That was Paul Chan's that I thought was cool. But at the same time, I'm also like, as a curator, sometimes the artist's like, I know when it's gonna work. And I'm always like, oh boy. So like, like here we go.
Just to intervene, I actually think that this is a very interesting conversation in general, because the KPIs are always there haunting us, whether it's because of a grant proposal or of some form of reporting. And the key performance indicators, I think, have to change all the time. I do go back to the question of scale. For me, it is something that is much more a question around temporality. And one of the things that in one's own self-critical sort of processes of initiating things and then having to evaluate them in one way or the other, temporality is one of the ways in which it allows you to think intersectionally like this. So, like if my wish, or if the performance indicator that I would use will be how much people spend with each other or spend with art, which is one of my number one KPIs that I keep, then the questions to that measuring system is, did I consider the question of class? Meaning, aren't people working? Don't they have to go home, back with their family? Is there enough time that they could actually, there is every measuring system that you set in motion, however abstract or poetic or literal it could be, presents itself with a number of questions that open up another measuring system around your own offer or your own ends to arrive to the, to their own means to arrive to the ends that you've set. So I think that this question can be a whole other conversation, and I will give back it's very, very interesting. And I will give
No, but I want to say something to that because, like, I understand that. It's just like, it was the example he gave about the way that Paul Jeanne would measure success. And it's like if she would trust it enough to come and to because it met some of her resistance, or it sort of satisfied some of her resistance. And I find that a very dangerous measurement for success. So that's just what I say.
And also because I know Paul's an incredible assessor of people. So I think he read a certain subjectivity that would give a project a run for its money. And I think, and I'm only using that as one example because it caught me as like unusual. Because I'm used to most artists being very opaque about that answer, which I'm just to say, when I sign on to an artist, I'm like, we're going on that ride. You know what I mean? But I do know that question comes up. But I don't want to dwell on it because it really is such a K-hole. Well, or rabbit hole, as they say. Yeah.
It's like we sometimes assume that engaged means engaged in a certain way. So I mean, person that are critical can also be critical in different ways. And when I was a teenager, I used to work for a summer in a street theater, and I remember some of our most engaged audiences would be the ones that followed us the entire street, nagging about us and complaining about us to the other viewers, and like, isn't this, horrible performance? And that would be maybe the person that saw the entire performance, was the one who was the most against it, but it was a very engaged viewer.
That's so funny. Just to say something too about engagement.
Closing remarks, Nato.
When you write a book, it's like you do an art show that no one comes to. Like just to talk about art, like a book is one of the most lonely art forms because it's just on Amazon. You don't even know what's going on with it. You're just like, I wonder if there's any engagement happening. And I only say that. I mean, there's sales, but I have no idea if it's like pedagogically happening or whatever. So I don't want to get in this literal thing of like engagement is something you could look at or see people engaging with. I mean, it is a complex thing that's really hard to get your head around.
Okay, thank you so much. In a sec, we'll thank you. But first, let me think if I should not forget any practicalities. Maybe one of them is definitely that if you want to engage with the book of Nato, then there are a few copies to be sold at the hallway outside. I already know that Nato will be happy to oblige and sign them for you if you would be interested.
If you want Jeanne to sign it, she'll sign it too.
Exactly, perfect. And Merlijn maybe also even as well. There are drinks outside, so we can continue the conversation if you want. Thank you all three.